November 18th, 1995. Dawn. The Lehigh Valley holds fog like a secret. The air tastes of cold iron and something ending. Beyond the gates of South Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, past furnaces that have burned without interruption for over a century, a whistle sounds for the final time. The morning is gray and cold, the kind of Pennsylvania November that seeps into bones and stays there. Frost clings to the chain-link fences. Steam rises from vents and pipes, mixing with the fog until the massive structures seem to float, half visible, like ghosts of themselves. Inside Blast Furnace A steelworker named Herman Stengel raises a microphone. The men around him fall silent. Many have worked here for 30 years. Their fathers worked here before them. Their grandfathers before that. 3 generations of hands, calloused and burned, feeding the same fire. As molten iron pours from the furnace in a final nostalgic gush of metal and flame, Stengel begins to whistle. Amazing grace over the speaker system. The sound echoes through the cavernous building, bouncing off steel beams and settling into the bones of men who know they are witnessing the end of something that cannot be replaced. The last cast flows into insulated ladles, orange and white, bright as the sun. The metal moves with the same liquid grace it has shown for 132 years. Workers who have seen this sight 10,000 times watch as though seeing it for the first. Some remove their hard hats. Some wipe their eyes. None speak. Someone hangs an American flag from the crane that carries the final ladle. The public address system plays God Bless America. Outside, a dozen onlookers line the levee with cameras, photographing the smoke that rises against the gray Pennsylvania sky. The blast furnaces rise 230 feet into that sky. 5 of them remain, stretching nearly a quarter mile along the Lehigh River. They are beautiful in a brutal way, these towers of rust and iron, these cathedrals of industry that once employed more people than many American towns contain. The plant itself sprawls across 1,800 acres, a small city within a city, with its own railroad lines, its own fire department, its own power generation, its own rules. They have watched generations of men enter through the gates at dawn and leave at dusk, covered in grime that never fully washed away, smelling of sulfur and sweat. But that is just the surface. Behind these structures are stories that no photograph captures. Hundreds of thousands of invisible hands across a century. Coal dust settling into lungs. Men who kissed their wives goodbye and never came home. Fortunes built and squandered. Families lifted into the middle class and then dropped back into poverty. A city that rose with the furnaces and wondered how it would survive without them. They called it simply the Steel. For 100 years, it was the backbone of a city, the arsenal of a nation, and the second largest steel producer on earth. Bethlehem Steel built the Golden Gate Bridge. It built the George Washington Bridge. It built the Empire State Building, Rockefeller Center, Madison Square Garden in the Waldorf Astoria. It built the Hoover Dam in the prison on Alcatraz Island. It built the skeleton of New York's skyline in the frames of 1,000 warships that helped win 2 world wars. It forged the beams that let architects dream of touching the sky, and then made those dreams real, one riveted connection at a time. And then it built nothing at all. About 500 workers lost their jobs that November day. They were the last of a workforce that once numbered 300,000 across the company's plants and shipyards. They walked out through gates their grandfathers had entered, carrying lunch pails and memories, and a question that would follow them for the rest of their lives. What now? Say what you want about the steel company, one retired worker said that day, standing in the cold outside the furnace. But it was a great place to work. It was also a dangerous place to work. a demanding place, a place where men traded their bodies for wages and their health for pensions that would later be reduced to fractions of what was promised. A place where the heat could kill you in summer and the cold could kill you in winter, and the machinery could kill you any day of the year. The company town that surrounded the plant would spend decades trying to reinvent itself. The workers who lost their jobs would scatter to different industries, different cities, different lives. Some would find new careers, many would not. Alcoholism, depression, and early death would follow the closure like shadows. Can industry make a nation immortal if it slowly eats the people who run it? Can a company build monuments that last centuries while the workers who built them are forgotten within a generation? And the real question, the one that hung over Bethlehem from the beginning and remains unanswered today, who actually paid for American steel? The investors took their profits. The executives retired to mansions. The buildings still stand in New York and San Francisco, steel bones holding up glass and concrete, carrying the weight of millions of people who never think about where that strength came from. The workers are mostly gone now. The old men who remember sit in diners and VFW halls, telling stories no one else recalls. Their children scattered. Their grandchildren know the name Bethlehem Steel only from highway signs and history books. But the furnaces remain. They were never demolished. The community would not allow it. They stand as monuments, rusting slowly in the Pennsylvania air, reminding anyone who looks that something massive once happened here. Something that built a nation and broke a city. Something that matters, even if we have forgotten why. If you find value in deep investigations into American industrial history and the workers who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which forgotten industry to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let's go back to the beginning. The story begins not with steel, but with iron, not with empire, but with failure. April 1857. A merchant named Augustus Wola stands on a hillside in South Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, looking down at the Lehigh River. The valley spreads before him, green and quiet, dotted with farms and small settlements. Morning mist rises from the water. The hills beyond are thick with timber. It is a peaceful scene, almost pastoral, giving no hint of the industrial inferno that will soon consume it. Wola sees what others miss: water for power, flowing steadily through the valley. Rail lines already pushing through the region, connecting the interior to the coastal cities. Anthracite coal from the nearby mountains, some of the finest fuel in America, hard and hot burning. Limestone deposits within easy reach, essential for the chemistry of iron production. Everything needed to forge metal, gathered by geological accident into one convenient location. Full envisions an ironworks. He calls his venture the Saucona Iron Company and begins raising capital from local investors. The timing seems perfect. America is expanding westward. Railroads need rails. Cities need beams. The demand for iron appears limitless. Within weeks, everything collapses. The panic of 1857 crashes through the American economy like a runaway locomotive. Banks fail. Railroad construction halts. Investors who promised capital disappear. Wola's company stalls before the first shovel breaks ground. But the idea survives. Good ideas often do, waiting for better timing and more determined men. 3 years pass. The economy recovers. The nation grows. The demand for iron returns stronger than before. By 1860, new investors reorganize the venture. They move the site, rename the company the Bethlehem Rolling Mill and Iron Company, and begin searching for someone who can turn vision into reality. They find him in John Fritz. Fritz is a self-taught engineer with a reputation for solving impossible problems. He has worked in iron mills since childhood, rising through observation and experimentation, rather than formal education. When the Bethlehem investors approach him, he is already known as one of the most innovative metallurgists in the country. He has pioneered the three-high rolling mill, a design that revolutionized how metal is shaped. He understands not just how iron behaves, but why. Fritz arrives in South Bethlehem and immediately begins designing something larger than a simple forge. He envisions blast furnaces capable of producing iron at industrial scale, furnaces that can run continuously, fed by the region's abundant coal and limestone. He plans rolling mills that can shape that iron into rails and beams. He sees not just a factory, but a system, an integrated operation where raw materials enter at one end and finished products emerge at the other, where every step connects to the next in a chain of transformation. The site he chooses stretches along the Lehigh River, using the water for power and cooling. Rail connections are established to bring ore in and send products out. Everything is planned with expansion in mind. Fritz builds not for the present, but for a future he can already envision. On May 1st, 1861, the company reorganizes again, this time as the Bethlehem Iron Company. Alfred Hunt is named president. Construction of the first blast furnace begins on July 1st, 1861. The timing, by accident, is perfect. The Civil War has begun. The Union will need iron for weapons, for railroads, for the machinery of modern warfare. What had seemed like a speculative venture suddenly becomes a strategic necessity. The work proceeds through the war years. The first blast furnace ignites on January 4th, 1863. The fires, once lit, will not stop burning for 132 years. The first rolling mill begins operation, and on September 26, 1863, the first railroad rails roll off the line. A machine shop follows in 1865. A second blast furnace in 1867. The operation expands steadily, adding capacity as demand grows. The company produces rails for the railroads that are stitching the nation together, connecting East Coast cities to the western frontier. But competition is fierce. Pittsburgh firms like Carnegie Steel have advantages of scale and location. Bethlehem Iron remains a regional player, profitable but not dominant. One iron works among many in a rapidly industrializing nation. The transformation begins in the 1880s when the United States Navy decides to rebuild its fleet. For decades, American warships had been wooden vessels, adequate for coastal defense but obsolete compared to European navies. Now the government wants steam-powered, steel-hulled ships capable of projecting power across oceans. This requires armor plate, heavy guns, and precision forgings that few American companies can produce. Bethlehem Iron sees opportunity. The company builds a heavy forging plant, acquiring equipment capable of producing the massive components required for modern warships. The forge hammer weighs 125 tons. The hydraulic presses can shape metal that no other American facility can handle. The company begins producing armor plate for naval vessels, gun forgings that weigh tons, components that require precision measured in thousandths of an inch. The work demands new techniques, new equipment, and new levels of quality control. A flaw in armor plate could mean a battleship sunk. An imperfection in a gun forging could mean an explosion that kills the crew. The company rises to the challenge, developing expertise that sets it apart from competitors focused on rails and structural products. By the 1890s, Bethlehem Iron has transformed from a rail producer into a strategic military contractor. The company supplies armor and guns for the new American fleet, becoming one of only two domestic sources for such materials. In 1893, the company displays its industrial power at the Chicago World's Fair. Bethlehem provides the iron for the world's first Ferris wheel, a 264-foot structure that holds 2,000 passengers. The axle alone weighs over 45 tons, the largest single steel forging ever constructed at the time. The forging is a marvel and an advertisement. It announces to the world that Bethlehem can manufacture at scale, with precision, at the very edge of what technology allows. In 1899, the company's majority stockholders, Joseph Wharton and Robert Linderman, decide to reorganize. They create the Bethlehem Steel Company, separating steel operations from the legacy iron business. The new name signals a new direction. Iron is the past. Steel is the future. The company is ready for transformation. It needs only a transformative leader. He is already on his way. Charles Michael Schwab was not born to wealth. He entered the world on February 18th, 1862, in Williamsburg, Pennsylvania, the son of a woolen worker and blanket manufacturer. His education was modest, his circumstances humble. His ambition was neither. At 17, Schwab took a job as a common laborer at Andrew Carnegie's Edgar Thomson Steel Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania. The pay was minimal. The work was brutal. The opportunity was unlimited for anyone with eyes to see it. Schwab's talent was not for metalwork. It was for people. He possessed an extraordinary ability to charm, to negotiate, to make men believe he was on their side, even as he extracted more labor from them. He could walk a factory floor and remember every worker's name. He could sit with financiers and speak their language fluently. He moved between worlds with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. Carnegie noticed. Carnegie always noticed talent. By 19, Schwab was assistant manager of the plant. By 25, after the plant superintendent was killed in an industrial accident, Schwab assumed command. He was running one of the largest steel operations in America before most men had found their first real job. In 1892, Carnegie gave Schwab his most difficult assignment. The Homestead strike had turned violent, leaving workers and Pinkerton guards dead, the plant in chaos, and relations between labor and management shattered. Carnegie sent Schwab to heal the wounds and restore production. Schwab succeeded where others had failed. He improved labor relations, while simultaneously increasing efficiency. He made workers feel valued while demanding more from them. It was a performance that would define his career, this ability to take from people, while making them feel grateful for the opportunity. By 1897, at 35 years old, Charles M. Schwab became president of the Carnegie Steel Company. His annual compensation exceeded $1 million, a sum that placed him among the wealthiest executives in America. But Schwab wanted more. He always wanted more. In December 1900, Schwab attended a dinner at the University Club in New York. The guest list included the most powerful financiers in America, chief among them J.P. Morgan. After dinner, Schwab delivered what became known as the most expensive speech in history. For hours, without notes, he outlined a vision for the American steel industry. Consolidate the major producers. Eliminate wasteful competition. Control pricing and distribution. Create an entity so large that no competitor could challenge it. No customer could refuse it. No government could ignore it. Morgan listened. Carnegie, then the richest man in America, listened through intermediaries. The result was United States Steel Corporation, formed in 1901. It was the first billion-dollar company in American history, a combination of Carnegie Steel, Federal Steel, and numerous smaller producers. Schwab became its first president, but corporate life did not suit him. Schwab chafed under Morgan's bureaucracy. He made decisions without consulting the board. He spent lavishly, living like the emperor he believed himself to be. When reports emerged that he had lost vast sums gambling at Monte Carlo, the scandal gave Morgan's allies the ammunition they needed. In 1903, Schwab resigned from U.S. Steel. He was 41 years old, wealthy beyond most men's dreams, and humiliated. He did not retire. He pivoted. Schwab had quietly acquired a controlling interest in the Bethlehem Steel Company back in 1901, purchasing it as a personal investment separate from U.S. Steel. The company was small, producing less than 1% of national steel capacity. Most observers saw a minor regional operation with limited potential. Schwab saw something else. He saw shipyards that could build the Navy's expanding fleet. He saw forging capabilities that no other company possessed. He saw a platform from which to build a second empire. Quote, 4. He declared publicly, Ticker, quote, Marzer 5. On December 10, 1904, Schwab reorganized the company as Bethlehem Steel Corporation. He became its first president and chairman of the board. The new entity included steel plants in Pennsylvania, iron mines in Cuba, and shipyards on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. Schwab hired Eugene G. Grace, a young electrical engineer with exceptional management skills. Where Schwab was visionary and flamboyant, Grace was methodical and relentless. Together, they formed a partnership that would build Bethlehem from a minor producer into a global industrial power. The transformation began with a gamble. Traditional steel beams were heavy and narrow. They could support buildings of moderate height, bridges of limited span. But the ambitions of American architects were growing faster than the technology could support them. Cities wanted to build upward. Engineers needed steel that could make it possible. A new design existed, the wide flange structural beam. It distributed weight more efficiently than traditional shapes. It was lighter, yet stronger. It could support structures of unprecedented height and bridges of unprecedented length. The problem was manufacturing. Mass production required new equipment, new processes, and new investments that might never pay off. The gray rolling mill could produce these beams, but at enormous cost. The machinery was expensive. The process was unproven at scale. The market was theoretical. No one knew if contractors would actually buy wide flange beams in sufficient quantities to justify the investment. Charles Schwab's most famous remark came during this period, in a conversation with his secretary about whether to proceed with the risky investment. "I've thought the whole thing over," Schwab said, "and if we are going bust, we will go bust big." In 1908, Bethlehem Steel installed the gray rolling mill and began producing the nation's first wide flange structural shapes. The beams were lighter, wider, and cheaper than anything previously available. Engineers called it the Bethlehem beam. Construction workers called it a revolution. The wide flange beam made skyscrapers possible. Before Bethlehem's innovation, tall buildings required massive stone or brick walls to support their own weight. The higher you built, the thicker the walls at the base, until eventually the walls consumed so much floor space that additional height became impractical. Steel frames changed the equation. The frame carried the load. The walls became mere curtains, thin barriers against weather rather than structural elements. But standard steel beams limited height. Wide flange beams removed those limits. Suddenly, buildings could rise as high as elevators could climb, and ambition could reach. New York City became Bethlehem Steel's greatest customer and greatest advertisement. By the 1920s, the company's chief engineer Carson F. Diefenderfer could say without exaggeration, Bethlehem Steel owned New York. The numbers tell part of the story. 80% of New York's skyscrapers used Bethlehem Steel. The company provided the structural framework for buildings that would define American architecture for a century. The Empire State Building rose on Bethlehem beams. Construction began in March 1930, and the company supplied 57,000 tons of steel for the project. The Waldorf Astoria, Rockefeller Center, Madison Square Garden, the Chrysler Building's foundations, the towers of Manhattan climbed skyward on metal forged in Pennsylvania. But Bethlehem built more than buildings. The company built the infrastructure of American civilization. The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco required steel from 5 different Bethlehem plants. The metal was manufactured, loaded onto rail cars, shipped to Philadelphia, and transported through the Panama Canal to the Pacific coast. The George Washington Bridge, spanning the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey, used Bethlehem steel throughout its structure, over 34 miles of wire rope. The Benjamin Franklin Bridge in Philadelphia, the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge, the Peace Bridge between Buffalo and Canada, all rose on Bethlehem metal. The Hoover Dam, holding back the Colorado River to bring water and power to the Southwest. The Cathedral of Learning at the University of Pittsburgh, the second tallest education building in the world. The prison on Alcatraz Island. Bridges and buildings and infrastructure across every state in the Union. Between 1905 and 1999, Bethlehem Steel produced over 1 billion tons of steel. That is enough material for more than 12,000 Golden Gate bridges. The production required an army. At its peak, the company employed over 300,000 workers across its plants and shipyards. The Bethlehem facility alone had 30,000 employees, occupying 20% of the city's land. The Lackawanna plant, near Buffalo, covered 1,300 acres and employed 20,000 more. But the impressive numbers concealed harder truths. The buildings were beautiful. The bridges were elegant. The steel was sound. The human cost of making it was something else entirely. Behind every beam, every rivet, every mile of cable were hands. Human hands that burned and bled and broke. Human bodies that bent under the weight of 12-hour shifts and straightened only in coffins. Human lives traded for wages that seemed generous until you calculated the price in years and health and hope. The men who made steel did not share in the mansions and penthouses their labor made possible. They lived in row houses within walking distance of the furnaces. They breathed air thick with smoke. They died young if the furnaces did not kill them first. This is the part of the story that the skyline does not tell. They came from everywhere. In the decades before World War I, they arrived from the villages of Eastern Europe, Poles, Slovaks, Hungarians, Ukrainians. Their names difficult for American foremen to pronounce. They came from Ireland and Italy and Wales, from places where the soil was exhausted and the future seemed closed. They came because someone from their village had written home about jobs in Pennsylvania, about wages that seemed impossible, about a chance to build something from nothing. South Bethlehem, transformed overnight. The quiet town along the Lehigh River became a babel of languages and cultures. A dozen tongues echoed through boarding houses and saloons where men drank away the exhaustion of 12-hour shifts. Churches rose to serve Catholics and Orthodox believers, their spires competing with the smokestacks for dominance of the skyline. Ethnic neighborhoods formed, each block a fragment of the old country transplanted to America, where the smell of pierogi mixed with the ever-present tang of sulfur. The smokestacks were visible from every street, from every window, from every front porch, where women watched for husbands who might not return. The rumble of machinery never stopped, not for Sundays, not for holidays, not for the births and deaths that marked the passage of ordinary life. The plant operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The fires never went out. The whistle that marked shift changes became the heartbeat of the town, regulating sleep and meals and prayers. The work was hot, loud, and dangerous. Steelworkers labored shifts that stretched to 14 hours, 6 or 7 days a week. The furnaces generated temperatures that no human body was designed to endure. Men worked within feet of molten metal heated to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Metal that moved with beautiful, deadly fluidity. Metal that could kill in an instant if a ladle tipped, or a chain broke, or a tension wavered. The open hearth process required constant attendance. Workers tested and adjusted the molten mixture over 24-hour cycles, checking temperature and composition, adding elements to achieve the proper grade. The heat radiating from the furnaces could be felt from 100 feet away. In summer, men collapsed from heat exhaustion. In winter, the contrast between the inferno inside and the freezing air outside created a permanent fog that hung over the plant. Old-timers said the town was never fully visible, always half hidden in smoke and steam. The noise was relentless. The roar of the furnaces, the crash of metal against metal, the screech of cranes, and the thunder of drop forges created a wall of sound that made conversation impossible. Workers communicated through hand signals, through gestures learned over years. Many went deaf by middle age, the price of earning a living. One veteran described it decades later. Quote 9. Accidents were not exceptions. They were expected. They were, in the cold calculus of industrial production, acceptable. Over 500 workers died on the job at Bethlehem Steel between 1905 and 1941. Hundreds, perhaps thousands more were badly injured. Burns from molten metal that scarred men for life, leaving faces and arms and chests marked with the permanent signature of the furnace. Crushed limbs from machinery that moved faster than reflexes could respond. Falls from heights that the human body was never meant to occupy. From trestles and platforms without railings. From scaffolding that gave way without warning. Explosions from gas leaks that gave no warning, incinerating men where they stood. The death notices appeared in local newspapers, like weather reports, routine and regular. Quote 10. Quote 11. The brevity of the announcements mirrored the brevity of the morning. There was always another shift to work, another family that needed the wages. The men who worked these jobs were desperately poor and mostly immigrants. Few spoke English. Fewer understood their rights, if rights existed at all in the early 20th century workplace. They accepted the danger because the alternative was no work at all, because 12 cents an hour was more than they could earn anywhere else, because the mill offered the only path from poverty that they could see. The company kept records. The families kept graves. In 1910, the workers tried to fight back. The strike began on February 4th. The grievances were fundamental. Workers wanted Sundays off. They wanted wages raised from 12 cents an hour for common laborers. They wanted changes to the bonus system that forced even skilled workers to labor overtime, just to earn a living wage. Charles Schwab refused to negotiate. Instead, he called in the newly formed Pennsylvania State Police. When officers charged into a crowd of bystanders, beating men, women, and children, a riot erupted. The violence made national headlines but changed nothing. The strike lasted 108 days. At its peak, nearly 9,000 workers participated. By May, only a fraction remained. The United States Bureau of Labor investigated and found that over 97% of the workforce endured workdays of 10 hours or more. 51% worked 12 hours or more. 29% worked 7-day weeks with no extra pay for Sunday labor. The strike failed. The workers returned to the furnaces. Schwab kept unions out of Bethlehem Steel throughout his lifetime. The company would not unionize until 1941, 2 years after his death. For the men who stayed, the mill became identity. It passed from father to son like an inheritance, like the family name, like the color of eyes. Generations worked the same departments, learned the same skills, breathed the same air thick with particles that would settle in lungs and remain there for decades. Boys grew up knowing they would enter the gates when they turned 18, just as their fathers had, just as their sons would. It was not a choice. It was simply what men from South Bethlehem did. The Czech family of Bethlehem had 9 brothers who worked at the plant. Along with their father, their sister, and 2 of their sons, they accumulated 441 years of combined service at Bethlehem Steel. 441 years. Nearly half a millennium of labor from a single family, poured into furnaces and rolled into beams that would hold up buildings and bridges across the nation. Their story was not unusual. It was simply more documented than most. The city itself became an extension of the company. Quote, 12-1, veteran recalled. Quote, 13. School schedules aligned with shift changes so fathers could walk children to school on their way to or from work. Politicians answered to plant managers, knowing that the company's preferences carried more weight than any ballot. The company provided housing, stores, medical care, everything a family needed from birth to burial. Company doctors delivered babies. Company stores sold groceries. Company undertakers buried the dead. A man could live his entire life, every significant moment from first breath to last, within the company's domain, never needing to seek anything beyond its reach. It was paternalism. It was control. It was, for a time, also prosperity. A steel worker's wages could support a family, buy a house, send children to school. The work was brutal, but the reward was entry into the American middle class. For immigrants who had fled poverty and oppression, this was the promise fulfilled. Then came the wars, and the wars changed everything. In 1914, Bethlehem Steel employed 15,600 people. Annual steelmaking capacity stood at 1.1 million tons. The company was prosperous, growing, ambitious. Then Europe went to war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand triggered a cascade of alliances and mobilizations that would leave millions dead and empires destroyed. For Bethlehem Steel, it triggered something else, the greatest opportunity in company history. The Allied powers needed weapons. They needed ships. They needed ammunition in quantities that European factories could not supply. American industry, officially neutral, was free to sell to anyone who could pay. And the Allies could pay. Bethlehem Steel held a virtual monopoly on contracts to supply the Allies with certain kinds of munitions. Charles Schwab made frequent trips to Europe, negotiating deals and cultivating relationships. When American neutrality laws threatened to block shipments, Schwab funneled goods through Canada. The profit motive did not recognize borders. Eugene Grace, now company president, surveyed the flood of orders and reportedly told his colleagues, "Gentlemen, we are going to make a lot of money." He was right. By the time America entered the war in April 1917, Bethlehem Steel had accumulated over $1.3 billion in orders for ammunition, battleships, aircraft components, and bomb casings. Employment more than doubled. The company produced vast quantities of armor, ordnance, guns, and ships for the U.S. and Allied forces. In 1918, President Woodrow Wilson personally asked Schwab to take charge of American shipbuilding as Director General of the Emergency Fleet Corporation. Schwab accepted and transformed the operation, abandoning cost-plus contracts that rewarded inefficiency in favor of fixed-price agreements that demanded results. The war ended in November 1918. Bethlehem Steel emerged as one of the largest companies in America, its reputation sealed, its wealth immense. The experience proved something that the company would not forget. War was good for business. The interwar years brought continued growth. Bethlehem built bridges and buildings. It acquired competitors. The Lackawanna Steel Company was purchased in 1922 for $60 million, adding massive capacity near Buffalo and iron ore mines in the Great Lakes region. The company expanded across the country, from Sparrows Point in Maryland to shipyards in San Francisco. Then came the Second World War, and the Second War made the first look like a rehearsal. In 1941, as America prepared for a conflict everyone knew was coming, Bethlehem Steel geared for production on a scale never before attempted. President Franklin D. Roosevelt attended the launching of the first Liberty ship, SS Patrick Henry, at Bethlehem's Baltimore shipyard on September 27, 1941. It was Liberty Fleet Day. The nation was building its arsenal. Pearl Harbor came 11 weeks later. In 1943, Eugene Grace made a promise to President Roosevelt. Bethlehem Steel would manufacture one ship per day. He kept that promise. He exceeded it by 15 vessels. Bethlehem Shipbuilding Corporation operated 15 shipyards across the country, from Quincy, Massachusetts to San Francisco, California, from Staten Island to Sparrows Point. During the war, those yards produced 1,121 ships, more than any other builder in America. The company's output represented nearly 1/5 of the entire U.S. Navy's two-ocean fleet. The production was staggering in its scale and speed. Liberty ships, designed to be built quickly from prefabricated sections, slid down the ways at a pace that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. Victory ships followed, faster and more capable. Destroyer escorts, landing craft, cargo vessels, tankers. The shipyards produced every type of vessel the Navy required. At peak production, Bethlehem Steel employed almost 300,000 people. Of those, 180,000 worked in shipbuilding alone. The Lackawanna plant became the world's largest steelmaking operation, a 1,300-acre complex employing 20,000 workers, producing armor, plate, and structural steel around the clock. 3 shifts, 7 days a week, the furnaces never cooling, the hammers never silent. The statistics from this period stagger the imagination. 70% of airplane cylinder forgings came from Bethlehem, a quarter of all warship armor plate, a third of the big cannon forgings. The company built the guns, the turrets, and the armor for the USS Missouri, the battleship where Japan would sign its surrender in Tokyo Bay. When the Missouri sailed into Tokyo Harbor in September 1945, it carried Bethlehem Steel in its hull, its deck, its massive 16-inch guns, a floating monument to Pennsylvania industry, arriving to accept the enemy's defeat. A historian later assessed the contribution. Quote 15. The statement seems extravagant until you consider the numbers. Over 1,000 ships, millions of tons of armor and ordnance, the structural steel for countless military installations, the forgings for weapons that turned the tide of battle after battle. Without Bethlehem, the Allied war machine would have run on a fraction of its actual power. The war changed the workforce as well as the production numbers. Women entered Bethlehem Steel for the first time, taking positions on factory floors and in company offices. They joined the national, quote, 16 phenomenon, welding and drafting and assembling alongside the men who remained. At one point, over 700 women worked at the Hingham shipyard alone. When the war ended, they were promptly fired to make room for returning veterans. Victory in 1945 seemed to confirm everything the company believed about itself. Bethlehem Steel had helped save democracy. Its plants hummed with purpose. Its workers were heroes. Its future appeared unlimited. The executives who gathered in the boardroom in Bethlehem looked out over an empire of furnaces and rolling mills and shipyards, and they saw permanence. They saw a company that had existed for nearly a century and would exist for centuries more. They saw American industrial might that no foreign competitor could ever match. At the end of World War II, American steel plants produced 72% of the world's steel and 67% of the world's pig iron. Bethlehem alone produced 23 million tons a year. The dominance appeared permanent. It appeared inevitable. It appeared to be the natural order of things. It was an illusion. The seeds of destruction had already been planted. They would take decades to bloom, but they were already in the ground, watered by complacency and fertilized by arrogance. The war that made Bethlehem Steel had also remade its future competitors. American bombs had flattened steel mills across Germany and Japan. The factories that once produced tanks and warships for the Axis lay in ruins, their equipment destroyed, their workers scattered or dead. The industrial base of two major nations had been reduced to twisted metal and broken concrete. Rubble can be cleared, and what rises from rubble can be better than what stood before. The Marshall Plan and similar aid programs poured billions of American dollars into reconstructing allied and former enemy nations. Part of that reconstruction involved steel industries. Germany and Japan rebuilt their mills from the ground up, using the latest technology, the most efficient designs, the lessons learned from decades of metallurgical research. They installed continuous casting, a process that eliminated the intermediate step of pouring molten steel into ingots before reshaping it. They built basic oxygen furnaces, which could produce steel faster and with less energy than the open hearth furnaces that American mills still used. They adopted electric arc technology, which could melt scrap metal into new steel with remarkable efficiency. Their new facilities were modern, streamlined, and cheap to operate. They did not carry the burden of aging equipment. They did not support pension funds built up over generations. They did not employ workers whose wages reflected decades of union negotiation in a protected market. They started fresh, unburdened by history. America, meanwhile, rested on the machines that had won the war. The blast furnaces at Bethlehem and Lackawanna and Sparrows Point were engineering marvels of their era. They had produced steel for bridges and battleships, skyscrapers and submarines. They had run continuously for decades, tended by generations of workers who knew every gauge and valve. They were also obsolete. The technology that won the war in 1945 was already outdated by 1955. Continuous casting could produce steel faster and cheaper than the traditional ingot method. Basic oxygen furnaces were more efficient than open hearth processes. Electric arc furnaces, powered by cheap electricity, could melt scrap metal into new steel at a fraction of the cost of integrated production. Bethlehem Steel's management did not see urgency. For 2 decades after the war, the company operated without significant foreign competition. American steel dominated global markets. Wages rose steadily. Benefits expanded. Production continued on equipment that was paid for, familiar and functional. Why invest billions in new technology when the old technology still worked? Why retrain workers when the existing workforce knew their jobs? Why risk change when the status quo was profitable? The company expanded instead of modernizing. New facilities were added, but they replicated existing methods rather than embracing new ones. The Burns Harbor plant, built between 1962 and 1964 in Indiana, was Bethlehem's largest and most modern facility. Even it relied on traditional integrated steelmaking rather than newer alternatives. In 1950, Bethlehem Steel employed over 100,000 workers. The Bethlehem plant alone had 24,000. The company was the backbone of the Lehigh Valley, the largest employer in the region, a source of civic pride and economic stability. The 1950s and 1960s were boom years. Quote 17. One veteran recalled, Bethlehem Steel rebuilt Europe. It supplied structural steel for a rapidly growing America. It produced the iconic I-beam that gave buildings their vertical ambition. In 1958, Bethlehem Steel's president, Arthur Homer, became the highest paid business executive in the United States. The company's future seemed assured. The first warning arrived in 1960. For the first time in American steel history, the nation imported more steel than it exported. No one in Bethlehem's executive offices seemed alarmed. By the late 1960s, American steel manufacturers were competing with imports from newer mills overseas that undercut domestic prices by 20% or more. Japanese steel, produced in facilities built with American aid and American technology, began arriving in American ports in growing quantities. The response was political rather than operational. The industry pressured Congress and the State Department to limit imports. In 1969, Japanese and European producers agreed to voluntary restrictions. The immediate threat was contained, but the underlying problem remained. American steel cost more to produce. Wages were higher. Equipment was older. The pension and healthcare obligations negotiated during decades of prosperity weighed heavily on every ton produced. A new threat emerged as well, one that came not from overseas, but from within American borders. Mini mills. These smaller operations represented a fundamentally different approach to steelmaking. Instead of starting with iron ore, limestone, and coal, the raw materials that integrated mills like Bethlehem had used for a century, mini mills started with scrap metal. Old cars, demolished buildings, discarded appliances, anything made of steel could be melted down and recast. Electric arc furnaces did the work. Massive electrodes plunged into piles of scrap, creating temperatures high enough to liquefy metal. The process was faster, cleaner, and dramatically cheaper than traditional steel making. A mini mill could be built for a fraction of the cost of an integrated facility. It could be located anywhere, with access to electricity and scrap, not just near ore deposits and coal mines. The mini mills required fewer workers. They had no blast furnaces to tend, no coke ovens to maintain, no ore ships to unload. Their employees were younger, often non-union, frequently located in right-to-work states where labor costs were lower and union organizing was difficult. They had no pension obligations from previous generations, no retirees drawing checks from funds that were never adequately filled, no legacy costs from decades of promises made during prosperous times. Every dollar of revenue went to current operations or current profits. Nucor, a company that began as a nuclear equipment manufacturer before pivoting to steel, pioneered the mini-mill approach. In the 1960s, Nucor was a rounding error in industry statistics, a curiosity that established players dismissed. By the 1980s, it would be eating Bethlehem's market share, one contract at a time. The executives in Bethlehem saw the competition. They had a choice. They could invest billions in modernization, adopt new technology, compete on efficiency, or they could extract what profits remained while the decline unfolded, paying dividends to shareholders and salaries to themselves while the industrial base crumbled. They chose extraction. Maintenance was deferred. Equipment aged. Positions were eliminated through attrition rather than strategic reorganization. When profits dipped, the response was to cut costs rather than invest in competitiveness. In 1973, Bethlehem Steel reached its peak. The company produced 23.7 million tons of raw steel, shipped 16.3 million tons of finished product, and reported net income of $207 million. It seemed like vindication. It was actually the last gasp. 4 years later, everything collapsed. The decline, when it came fast. In 1977, Bethlehem Steel reduced steelmaking capacity at Lackawanna and Johnstown. Employment at the Lackawanna plant, which had been nearly 20,000 in 1965, fell to 8,500. The cuts were presented as temporary adjustments. They were the beginning of the end. The numbers told a story that executives could no longer ignore. Foreign steel, primarily from Japan, but increasingly from South Korea and emerging producers in the developing world, was simply cheaper. American integrated mills could not match the prices without losing money on every ton. The wage gap was substantial. American steelworkers, represented by powerful unions, had negotiated compensation packages that reflected decades of prosperity, healthcare benefits, pension guarantees, wages that supported middle-class lives. These were not luxuries. They were the rewards of dangerous, demanding work. But they added cost to every beam and plate that rolled off the line. The pension problem was particularly severe. During the 1950s, when the future seemed limitless, executives like Eugene Grace had failed to adequately fund retirement obligations. The assumption was that growth would continue forever, that future profits would cover future costs. Now the bill was coming due. As the workforce shrank, the ratio of retirees to active workers climbed. Every ton of steel had to cover not just the wages of the workers who made it, but the pensions of the workers who had made steel decades before. The mini-mills compounded the pressure. Companies like Nucor had no legacy costs. Their workers were younger, non-union, often located in right-to-work states where labor was cheaper. They had no pension obligations from previous generations. They could sell steel at prices that Bethlehem literally could not afford to match. In 1980, Donald Troutline became chairman of Bethlehem Steel. He inherited a company with outmoded production plants, steep labor costs, and eroding profits. The steel industry was experiencing its worst downturn in 50 years. Troutline began cutting. Subsidiaries were sold. Plants were closed or consolidated. The West Coast steel operations were shuttered. Shipbuilding activities were scaled back. Every expense was examined. Every operation questioned. It was not enough. In 1982, Bethlehem Steel reported a loss of $1.5 billion. The number was unprecedented in company history, a shock that reverberated through the Lehigh Valley and the broader American economy. The company responded by shutting down much of its operations. steel making at Lackawanna was eliminated. The massive plant that had once employed 20,000 workers and produced steel for 2 world wars became a skeleton operation, then a ruin. Other facilities followed. Between 1982 and 1985, the company posted total losses of $1.9 billion. Employment collapsed. At the start of the 1980s, Bethlehem Steel had over 100,000 employees. By the middle of the decade, the number had fallen by more than half. The workers who lost their jobs were not young people who could easily retrain. They were men in their 40s and 50s who had spent their entire careers in the mill, whose skills were specific to an industry that was dying. What do you do when the only work you know no longer exists? Some found jobs as bus drivers, warehouse workers, retail clerks, positions that paid half what the mill had paid, without benefits, without security, without the dignity of making something with your hands that would last for generations. Many did not find work at all. The skills that made a man valuable in a steel mill, the ability to read a furnace, to judge the quality of a pour, to operate massive equipment with precision, meant nothing in the service economy that was replacing manufacturing. The steel towns of Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, and Maryland experienced social collapse alongside economic collapse. Families that had been stable for generations fractured under financial pressure. Homes that had been passed down were lost to foreclosure. Neighborhoods that had been tight-knit emptied as younger residents left for opportunities elsewhere. Alcoholism and drug abuse rates climbed. Domestic violence increased. Divorce rates rose. Suicide rates, particularly among middle-aged men, spiked in communities throughout the Rust Belt. Doctors and sociologists studied the phenomenon, trying to understand the health impacts of economic dislocation. They found increased rates of heart disease, of depression, of early death from causes that seemed unrelated to employment, but somehow weren't. They found that losing a job was not just a financial event, but a physical one. That the stress of unemployment damaged bodies as surely as the stress of the work itself. They had a name for what they observed. They called it despair, a clinical term for the destruction of hope, for what happens when people lose not just income, but identity, not just employment, but meaning. In 1986, Troutline resigned under pressure and criticism. His replacement, Walter Williams, had over 30 years of experience in the business. He understood the industry. He also understood that the momentum was nearly impossible to reverse. The company's stock hovered around an all-time low of $4 per share. Williams implemented campaigns to revitalize what remained of the core business. The company returned briefly to profitability in 1988. But the fundamental economics had not changed. Foreign steel was still cheaper. Mini mills were still growing. The pension obligations were still crushing. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, the closures continued. The Bethlehem plant itself, the original facility where the fires had burned since 1863, ended steelmaking operations in November 1995. The last cast, with Hermann Stengel whistling. Quote 18. Marked the end of 132 years of continuous operation. About 800 workers lost their jobs that day. They were the last of thousands who had walked those floors across generations. The company did not die immediately. Bethlehem Steel continued operations at other facilities, notably Sparrows Point and Burns Harbor. It exited the railroad car business in 1993. It ceased shipbuilding in 1997. Each divestiture was presented as a strategic decision to preserve the core. Each was actually a retreat. The final act was approaching. After the Bethlehem plant closed in 1995, the company limped forward on reduced capacity. Sparrows Point in Maryland, the massive facility on the Chesapeake Bay, continued producing steel. Burns Harbor in Indiana, the most modern of the integrated mills, remained operational. The company shed assets, reduced headcount, and attempted to find a sustainable business model in an industry that was fundamentally changed. The challenges multiplied rather than diminished. Foreign competition grew more intense, not less. South Korean producers, Chinese state-owned enterprises, and revitalized European mills continued to undercut American prices. The strong dollar through much of the 1990s made imports even cheaper relative to domestic production. The mini mills continued their advance. What began as a threat to low-end products expanded into more sophisticated offerings. Nucor and its competitors invested in new technology that allowed them to produce higher grades of steel, directly threatening markets that integrated mills like Bethlehem had considered secure. The asbestos crisis added a burden that had nothing to do with steel production. For decades, Bethlehem Steel had used asbestos extensively in its shipyards and mills. The material was an effective insulator, protecting workers and equipment from extreme heat. No one understood the long-term health consequences. By the 1980s, the consequences were becoming clear. Asbestos exposure caused lung disease, cancer, and mesothelioma. Workers who had labored in Bethlehem's facilities decades earlier were falling ill and dying. Lawsuits followed. Thousands of former workers and their families filed claims against the company. The legal costs accumulated, adding to the financial strain. Bethlehem Steel faced liability for decisions made generations before, decisions that seemed reasonable at the time and proved catastrophic in retrospect. The pension crisis, meanwhile, grew worse with each passing year. During the prosperous decades of the mid-20th century, Bethlehem Steel had promised generous retirement benefits to its workers. Those promises were backed by pension funds that assumed continued growth and profitability. When growth stopped and profitability vanished, the funding gap became a chasm. By the late 1990s, Bethlehem Steel had more retirees than active workers. Every ton of steel produced had to carry the weight of obligations accumulated over a century. The competition faced no such burden. The company attempted to diversify. It pursued contracts in plastics and chemical products. It explored partnerships and joint ventures. Nothing worked well enough or fast enough. In 2001, Bethlehem Steel filed for Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection. The filing was not a surprise. It was, by that point, almost a relief. The company became the 25th American steelmaking company in 4 years to seek bankruptcy protection. An entire industry was collapsing simultaneously. The bankruptcy proceedings revealed the depth of the financial problems. The pension fund was underfunded by billions of dollars. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the federal agency that ensures retirement benefits, assumed the obligation, the largest pension liability assumption in American history to that point. Retirees who had been promised full pensions received reduced payments. The guarantees they had worked for, the promises made by executives long dead, were broken. The company attempted to reorganize to emerge from bankruptcy as a leaner operation. But there was not enough value left to salvage. The steel industry had changed too much. The competitive position was too weak. The debts were too large. In 2003, Bethlehem Steel was dissolved. The remaining assets, including 6 plants and various mining and processing operations, were sold to International Steel Group for $1.5 billion. The buyer was Wilbur Ross, a financier who specialized in distressed industries. Ross combined Bethlehem's assets with other bankrupt steel companies to create a new entity, stripped of the pension obligations that had helped destroy the predecessors. In 2005, International Steel Group merged with Middle Steel. In 2006, Middle merged with Arcelor to form Arcelor Middle, one of the world's largest steel producers. American ownership of the assets of Bethlehem Steel had ended. The company that built the Golden Gate Bridge, the Empire State Building, and over 1,000 warships no longer existed. The name survived only in history books, on highway signs, and in the memories of workers who still remembered when the steel defined their lives. Charles Schwab did not live to see the end. He died in 1939, financially ruined by the Depression that followed his years of extravagant living. His mansion was seized by creditors. He died owing more than $300,000. His holdings in Bethlehem Steel, once worth a fortune, were virtually worthless at his death. Eugene Grace retired in 1957 and died in 1960, the same year that imports first exceeded exports. He did not see the collapse he helped create through decades of deferred investment and underfunded pensions. The men who built the empire escaped the consequences. The workers who trusted them did not. The blast furnaces still stand, 5 of them, rising 230 feet against the Pennsylvania sky, rusting slowly in the open air. They were never demolished. The community would not allow it. In 2007, the Sands Corporation purchased the Bethlehem Steel property for a casino and entertainment development. Construction began on a $600 million complex that would include gambling floors, hotels, restaurants, and event spaces. Ironically, the construction required 16,000 tons of structural steel. Due to a global shortage at the time, even that steel was difficult to find. The site is now called Steel Stacks. It is a 10-acre arts and entertainment district that draws over 1 million visitors annually. The Arts Quest Center offers concerts and performances where musicians play against a backdrop of rusting industrial machinery. The Wind Creek Casino offers gambling where men once gambled with their lives. The Hoover Mason Trestle, once an elevated railroad that carried raw materials to the furnaces, has been converted into a pedestrian walkway where tourists can stroll among the very structures that killed and maimed generations of workers. Visitors can walk the trestle, read interpretive signs explaining how steel was made, and photograph the massive structures that once employed their grandparents. They can buy commemorative merchandise and eat at restaurants with industrial-themed decor. The nation's largest free music festival, Music Fest, takes place here each summer, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors who dance beneath the blast furnaces. Holiday markets and comedy shows fill the calendar year-round. The National Museum of Industrial History operates on site, affiliated with the Smithsonian Institution. It tells the story of American manufacturing through artifacts and exhibits, preserving the memory of an era that shaped the nation. Visitors can see the tools workers used, the products they made, the protective equipment that often failed to protect them. The transformation has been called a success. The site generates tax revenue, provides jobs, and attracts tourists. A 2012 Federal Reserve study found that Bethlehem had the highest median household income, lowest poverty rate, and lowest violent crime rate among 13 comparable former industrial cities. But the jobs at Steel Stacks and the casino do not pay what the mill paid. Warehouse workers at the distribution centers that have replaced factories across America earn $15 an hour. Adjusted for inflation, a new hire at Sparrows Point in the mid-1990s would have earned between $21 and $30 an hour, plus benefits that built middle-class lives. The math does not compare. Across the country, the pattern repeated. The Lackawanna plant near Buffalo is now a Superfund site, a landscape of contaminated earth and partially demolished ruins. Wind turbines spin on the old slag heaps, generating clean energy where dirty steel once flowed. Sparrows Point, the massive facility on the Chesapeake Bay that once employed 30,000 workers, closed for good in 2012. The 300-acre site has been redeveloped as a distribution hub. Amazon and other logistics companies have built warehouses where blast furnaces once roared. The deep-water port that once received iron ore now receives automobiles. The workers who built America's infrastructure are mostly gone. The old men who remember sit in diners and union halls, telling stories that no one else recalls. Their children scattered to different industries, different cities, different lives. Their grandchildren know the name Bethlehem Steel only from history classes and highway signs. A former steelworker named Bruce Ward spent 27 years in the Bethlehem plant. After the closure, he reinvented himself as an artist, a photographer, a magician. When asked about his financial situation, he uses a phrase everyone knows. You've heard the term starving artist? His reinvention mirrors the city's. But reinvention has cost that statistics do not capture. Who paid for American steel? The investors who funded the mills took their profits and moved on. Some lost fortunes in market crashes. Most did not. The capital flowed to other opportunities, other industries, other chances to multiply. The executives who ran the company retired to comfortable lives. Charles Schwab died in debt, but he died having lived like a king for decades. Eugene Grace was the highest paid executive in America during years when his workers labored 14-hour shifts. The workers who made the steel paid with their bodies. Over 500 dead at Bethlehem alone between 1905 and 1941. And those were only the deaths that happened inside the plant. The slow deaths from lung disease, from asbestos, from chemicals that accumulated over decades. Those numbers were never counted. The communities that depended on steel paid with their futures. When the plants closed, the tax base vanished. Schools struggled. Infrastructure aged. Young people left for cities with opportunities, draining the population and leaving behind those too old or too tired to leave. We still drive on bridges built with Bethlehem steel. We still work in skyscrapers held up by Bethlehem beams. The Golden Gate Bridge carries 40 million vehicles a year across San Francisco Bay. Its cables strung on towers forged in Pennsylvania. The George Washington Bridge carries over 100 million vehicles annually. The busiest motor vehicle bridge in the world, its frame assembled from metal poured in South Bethlehem 8 decades ago. The Empire State Building still stands, still an icon, its skeleton of steel as sound today as when it was erected in 1931. Rockefeller Center still welcomes visitors. Madison Square Garden still hosts events. The infrastructure is there, aging but functional, still bearing the weight of American life. Drive across any major bridge on the East Coast. Walk through any major city's downtown. Look up at the buildings that define the skyline. Somewhere in that structure, embedded in the frame, invisible but essential, is steel that was made by men who have been dead for generations, in furnaces that have been cold for decades, by a company that no longer exists. The men who made it are mostly gone. The last of the workers who witnessed the golden age are in their 80s and 90s now, if they are alive at all. Their stories exist in oral histories, in documentary films, in the memories of children who grew up hearing about what their fathers and grandfathers did. Maybe that is the cost of progress. Maybe there is no other way to build a nation. Maybe every great achievement requires sacrifice, and the only question is who makes it and who benefits. Or maybe we decided it was easier not to look. The blast furnaces at steel stacks are lit up at night now. They glow in colors they never wore when they were working, blue and purple and gold, dramatic against the darkness. Tourists photograph them. Concert crowds cheer beneath their rusted frames. Children play in their shadows, having no idea what those shadows once meant to the men who worked in them. For some, it feels like celebration. For others, like memorial. For a few, like something harder to name, a kind of beautiful betrayal, perhaps, where the instruments of labor have been converted into instruments of leisure, where the site of sacrifice has become a site of entertainment. Memory has a price now, too. At steel stacks, there is a steel tribute wall where families can pay $250 to add a worker's name to the commemoration. The workers who built the bridges and buildings that define American cities are remembered in proportion to what their descendants can afford. Those who cannot pay are simply forgotten, their names lost to history, like the smoke that once rose from these furnaces and dispersed into the Pennsylvania sky. The fires are cold. The furnaces are silent. The company that built America's bones exists only in documents and photographs and the fading recollections of the very old. But something remains in the Lehigh Valley. Call it heritage. Call it grief. Call it the echo of 100,000 workers who gave their lives to an enterprise that used them and moved on. The steel is still standing. The workers are not. If this investigation mattered to you, please consider subscribing. These stories take time to research, and your support makes them possible. Tell me in the comments, which forgotten American industry should we explore next? The coal mines of Appalachia, the textile mills of New England, the automobile plants of Detroit, the copper mines of Montana, the company towns of Colorado. Everyone has a story. Everyone has a cost. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.